Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, Ken Michaels Radio, where we talk about the Beatles all the time. And we have a very special lineup for the show this time. Well, we always do. But in particular, we have three real scholars on the subject of the Beatles, and two of them in particular have been on many of my shows. Another one's been on a few of my other ones. And the topic is going to be the Beatles music, the early versus the late period. And the reason why I wanted to do this particular topic, this is something that's kind of been burning in me for a while, is because I've felt that over the last few years, well, really, I should say last few decades, there's been less and less of an appreciation for the Beatles' early works, and certainly more for their later works. And as a fellow chart geek, I always bring up the charts here on all my shows. Anytime the Beatles albums ever reappear on the Billboard album charts, it's always the later ones. It's always Abbey Road. Sometimes it's the White Album, sometimes Sgt. Pepper. You will get the Beatles one, but you'll never get
Mhm.
anything from Please Please Me through Revolver, despite all the respect that Revolver's gotten in the last few decades.
That's not did Hard Day's Night not even get a blip for its anniversary this summer?
No.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, yeah, that's why I wanted to do this. And in fact, on one of the podcasts that I do, Things We Said Today, there was a fan who approached me at one of Ken Womack's events for his Mal Evans book, and he said, "I got a great idea for your show. How come every time I listen to the Red album, it sounds like an oldies album, and every time I listen to the Blue album, it sounds like something contemporary?" I wanted to do something on Things We Said Today about that, and maybe sometime in the future we will. We never got around to it, but I thought it might be great to get the perspectives of, several people that I admire greatly on this particular subject. And so let me tell you who my guests are. First of all, we have Al Sussman, who's been a guest on this channel, who is actually one of the regular co-hosts on Things We Said Today. And since almost the very beginning of Beatlefan, he's been a writer for them and senior editor for the magazine. Also, the author of a book that came out several years ago that's still available, I just learned, on Amazon. Changin Times, 101 Days That Shaped a Generation. Al Sussman, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio.
Hi, Ken. How are you? And hi to our other two guests.
Yeah. And Bruce Spizer is no stranger to Beatle fans. He's written more Beatle books than anyone that I know. And you name it, the Beatles story on Capitol Records, the Beatles on VJ, the Beatles Swan Song. Who else would put out an entire book on Swan Song and the Beatles but Bruce Spizer? The Beatles solo records on Apple Records. And also in recent years, he's been doing books devoted to specific Beatles albums, from Sgt. Pepper to Let It Be, Abbey Road, Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine, Rubber Soul and Revolver, and the latest one coming out is on A Hard Day's Night. It's called A Hard Day's Night and More. So, Bruce, welcome back.
To be here, and I really love the topic. And as soon as you introduce our other illustrious panelists, I'll give you my take on it because I can't agree with you more about this is something that does need to be discussed.
Mhm.
Okay, and I'm proud to welcome Walter Everett to the channel. Walter is professor of music at the University of Michigan. It says in Wikipedia you're a music theorist. That's that's your
They
title.
got something right.
Okay.
It means when his talk is above my head here, you know.
He is also the author of several fine books, including The Beatles as Musicians, The Quarrymen Through Rubber Soul, and also The Beatles as Musicians, Revolver Through Anthology. And he collaborated with Tim Riley on a book called What Goes On, The Beatles, Their Music, and Their Time. And not that long ago, he appeared on the Things We Said Today podcasts with Jack Petrozelli and Cameron Greider, and they formed a group called the RPM School, and they have an online course on the Beatles where they go in depth on their music. So, Walter.
Thanks for
Well,
having me, Ken. Such a pleasure to be here.
okay. Well, before we get into that topic, As many Beatle fans are aware, just recently it was announced that there will be a box set coming out in November of the Beatles' Capitol records as they appeared in America from 1964, all in mono. And Bruce here has had the honor of doing liner notes for it. So I wonder if you can just tell the folks the work that you're doing liner notes wise and what to expect of what you can tell us in the box set.
Well, first of all, I think one of the things everyone will realize is that great time and care was taken on this project. The mastering was done by Ken Reeves out of Nashville, and he was using 1970s, early 70s Capitol equipment, which is the closest as you can get going back in time to the 60s. And in using this equipment for reference discs, first of all, we had the master tapes from Capitol, the original tape boxes, and the tapes were extremely well preserved. So that was good news. Very little fallout or anything like that with the tapes. And that was one thing. He also had, of course, the tape boxes, which had the EQing and echo and other information on them for reference. And I also sent him my mono first pressings. So he had that as reference. So with all of these sources, he was able to really do a good job of getting the records to sound like they did in 1964, only better. And by that, I mean that with today's more modern playing equipment, you don't have to worry about, gee, if we have a little bit too much bass, the needle's going to be jumping all over the place.
Mhm.
So I think these recordings will have more bass presence to them, not to the point of where you'll listen to it and go, nah, that's not how these things should sound. They're going to sound great, and they're going to be very true to 64, but imagine if in 64 you had a much better record player. If you truly wanted to duplicate the listening experience, you would need like a Hatbox record player that I used to have, and it hummed and all that other stuff. So, let's not overdo this. We want to make it an authentic experience. Trust me, it will sound great, and they will be very true to the original recordings. As far as what these come with, the idea was that this was going to be sold not only as a box set, but all of the albums, with the exception of the Beatles story, would be available individually.
Hmm.
So that meant, look, does it really make sense to do a nice book for the box when people buying, for example, Meet the Beatles and the Beatles' second album wouldn't get any liner notes? So the idea was, what if we were to do like a 4-page leaflet as an insert for all of these albums? And that was the decision that was made. And on the front page of it, as you can see, it looks like, oh, that looks like a tape box. It is. In the back, we'll have information such as publishing information, the running order of the songs, and the thank yous and all that other good stuff. And when you open it up in the center, you will find essays that I wrote for this project. And they also will have maybe one or so images. Obviously, we did not have a lot of space to notes. We couldn't reproduce my books in 2 pages. The idea, though, was for me to hit the highlights and explain why these records are important, how they performed on the charts for Ken, because he likes chart information.
And me too.
Yes, as everyone does, I said, how many copies they sold and things like that. And also to explain why Capitol did what they did. And in doing so, and we'll get to that as we move on this, you're going to find that this was not some random butcher job by Dave Dexter. You can say negative things about Dave Dexter, and that's fine. But what you can't say is that Dexter randomly picked these things and threw these things and stuck these things together. That is not true at all. It was more of a surgical job by Dave Dexter, removing songs to get to the target number of 12 and then 11. And we can talk about that later. And adding things that he felt would help sell the albums. So I don't know how much, Ken, you want me to keep going on that, or whether you want me to come back to that, or what do you want?
Just a couple more questions. First of all, will there be the Dave Dexter reverb sound?
Well, bear in mind, the mono albums, for the most part, are relatively dry. And let's take, for example, the Beatles' second album. The Beatles' second album has tremendous reverb, particularly
Mhm.
on Roll Over Beethoven, Please Mr. Postman, Money, and songs like that. The mono does not. The only song that you're really going to hear some amount of reverb on would, I think, be Thank You Girl, which is using the stereo mix folded down.
Yeah.
In that stereo mix by George Martin, done at that time, does have a bit of reverb. So bear in mind that for many of these albums, the Capitol, these really aren't, Capitol remixes or anything. Capitol didn't have master tapes to remix. What Capitol had were the finished master mixes. And then for a lot of these albums, what they would do is they would take the stereo mix and mix it, fold it down to a mono mix.
Mhm. Right.
Now you might say, boy, that's sacrilege. George Martin did these great mono mixes. Why did they do that? Their engineers felt that if you took a stereo mix and folded it down to mono, it would be fuller for some reason. But bear in mind, basically, that's what George Martin was doing, in the sense that he was doing a 2-track, because on these early recordings, and mixing that down, vocals on one side, music on the other, and getting the mix to where the balance was right. So, you can be the judge as to whether they sound better or not. They certainly sound different on some songs, but these will be the Capitol mono mix downs on several of the albums. And in some of them, they will be the George Martin mono mixes. But bear in mind, on some of the songs, George Martin did different mono mixes for the American and British markets, knowing that Capitol had a tendency to add reverb or do different things. And I guess his thinking was, I'll do that for them so everything will be all right. But what George Martin failed to take into account was Capitol was going to do what Capitol's going to do anyway. So on some of these, like particularly, say, I Feel Fine or She's a Woman on Beatles 65, you're going to get extra reverb. And the example I give to somebody is something that happened to me when I was at college. I went over to a football tailgate party, and there was a big pitcher of orange juice and next to it, a fifth of vodka. And so I assumed if I took some orange juice and poured it in a glass and put some vodka in the glass, I would have a perfect screwdriver. What I didn't know was the orange pitcher were pre-mixed screwdrivers. So in effect, I got a lot more vodka. So on those songs, you're going to get a lot more echo. But, for those of you who say, well, gee, I love the echo on Roll Over Beethoven. Why aren't I hearing that? How dare these people? They use the wrong tape. No, the mono tape is essentially flat. So I just want to warn people about that. You're going to listen to these records the way we listened to them in 1964. Because I don't know about you guys, but I didn't have a stereo player, and stereo albums cost $1 more. So I wasn't going to buy a stereo album in 1964. I didn't hear the Beatles album in a Beatles second album in stereo probably until 1968, when I started rebuying the albums in stereo.
Yeah.
So what you're going to get is what Americans heard in 64. 90% of those record sales were mono record sales, maybe even more, but at least 90% were mono.
Right. Bruce, I'm glad you mentioned Thank You Girl. It's one of a few tracks that were made from different edits for mono and stereo, not only different mixes, but actually different edits. So I was curious about that before you brought it up. It'll be interesting to hear the stereo edit in mono. Yeah.
All right. Was there any thought given to possibly putting this out on CD as well, or did they just want to stick to vinyl?
I have not heard any discussions on that. That doesn't mean there were no discussions, but I was not privy to any such discussions. From the get-go of when I first started my consulting on this project, everything was geared toward vinyl. And the questions were, do we do mono? Do we do stereo? Do we do both? Do we do this? Those types of back and forths. And I think the idea was, look, if we're making this something that's going to duplicate the listening experience in 1964, then we really should be doing mono rather than stereo, because not many people were hearing these tracks that way. I know that there's some people that, and this ties in with your theme, Ken, about why these things matter. Well, look, why do people not talk about these albums that much? Think about what you are talking about. Abbey Road, Sergeant Pepper, the White Album, Rubber Soul, Revolver, all these great albums. Very few people go, my favorite Beatle album is Meet the Beatles. But the reality is, it is a great album.
Absolutely.
As all these are. And I think if the Beatles had broken up in 1966, we'd be talking about these brilliant Beatle albums. It's just that they're, when you compare them to the other albums that are, quote, more progressive, we tend to forget how unique these albums were. And I'm going to toss this over to our good buddy Walter Everett in a second. But I'm going to say what I remember most about the early albums was, I was not a musical theorist, but even I could hear these songs had a lot more chord changes than the 1, 4, 5 progressions that Chuck Berry had, or the, major to major minor thing, with 4 chord specials that you heard all over again. So, why don't we turn it over to you, Walter, to explain
Oh, sure. Yeah.
why the music is so unique here.
Yeah, there's so many reasons. Harmony is one of them, the chord progressions. But, the Beatles were curious, and they had this excitement of youth, right? That they didn't carry into their later work as much. But, all of the falsetto things like in Please Please Me and in She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand, and all that excitement of building towards, dissonant harmonies and dissonant melodies. It just, that's why, they were shaking their hair too, but that's when all the young women in the audience would be just ecstatic. So much joy and excitement, exuberance in these kinds of things. There was so much tension in these early songs. The first 5 singles, I think, well, After Love Me Do anyway, really honed. They honed their skills on being able to bottle excitement and let it go when it was exactly the right moment. So, for instance, like, She Loves You, I think, is their first masterpiece of handling that tension. It starts off with the after the intro, I got to play on a cheesy Farfisa type sound because my piano's got one note that's way too loud on it, so I switched it to an organ here.
Not hearing anything.
I could put the tremolo on. We could pretend we're at the ballpark. Yeah, right. Right there, you get some unusual harmony because in this key of G major, you don't expect that chord. It's not built into the scale. It's got this pitch that's not part of the key. So it adds some juice there.
Can't really hear it.
Yeah, Zoom is not very
Yeah,
good for.
you hear it? I could turn it up. Is that better?
Well,
Play
play something.
You know what? Let me do a switch here. I bet this will make the difference. So
Okay.
There we go.
Oh, yeah. There we go.
Now we're at the ballpark.
Yes.
there's the chord that is outside the scale. And there's the added 6 that George Harrison insisted on singing that note that's not part of the chord because he's heard Carl Perkins use it all the time.
Mhm.
But the melody starts off very unassuming. It's really, it's very closely based on a Bobby Rydell pop song.
Mhm.
and not so much there, and then you repeat it. And there's some tension there. And then, you know, another chord outside the scale, but instead of having a tone that's raised, you get a tone that's lowered from there to there. So it's a mishmash. And then, you know, you get to the end of the pre-chorus, and instead of moving ahead to something really dynamic, George just gives you that little Chuck Berry lick there. We go back to that simple, unassuming verse, and then the next time the pre-chorus goes into that woo and the falsetto. And that's where all the tension comes together in the chorus of the song. And so there's an example for you, Bruce. If you're interested in chords and harmony, the major 2 chord, it creates a sense of wonder. And then that diminished 2 chord, very unusual in pop music.
And then, you know, Ringo's thundering drum introduction. I mean, it just, you know, grabs you right away, and the whole catchy bit. But
Right.
I was on a panel many years back for I think it was the 40th or 50th, probably 40th or 50th anniversary of the Beatles in New Orleans. And one of the panelists was a really good black musician who used to play at a bunch of parties when I was in high school and college, a guy named Deacon John. And he said, I love playing the Beatles music because it was so different from anything else. And he said, so when they came to town, he said, of course, I had to go to the concert and see these guys. And, and that was for him as a musician, you could tell. But even as a teenager, I could hear something's different here.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, the excitement, the tension that was building up on this.
That's right. That's right. And Ringo's opening roll on the floor tom.
Oh, yeah.
It's just like there's no other song that does that. In fact, one of the stories I love is when Billy Preston's making his appearance at the Apple Studios in January '69, and they're reliving the old days in Hamburg and talking about old things, and somehow Jimmy Nicol came up. And you remember Paul tells Billy the story about Jimmy Nicol, the first concert he played in Ringo's place. And they were doing She Loves You. And McCartney counts off 1, 2, and nothing happens. He had no idea he had to do the intro on the floor tom. But there's all kinds of tension, rhythmic tension from Ringo's drumming, harmonic tension, just melodic tension. Think about like the melody in And I Love Her. Think of McCartney leaps up to a note that's a ninth of the chord. It's not a member of the chord to which but it does resolve down. And that melodic ninth, just, harmony aside, just the leap up to a note that doesn't belong. It's not something that knocks you over the head, but unconsciously, it adds a little tension. It adds a little juice to the melody.
When you bring up And I Love Her, what I find fascinating about it, and it's apropos with, the 60th anniversary of A Hard Day's Night, was, you listen to on Anthology, take one of the song, and it starts off with John strumming his Rickenbacker or whatever, and then it evolves. But what makes the song, and Paul's admitted this, is they're in the studio, and George Martin says, well, it kind of needs an introduction. And George just says, "Oh, you mean something like this?" Da 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 dum.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah,
Boy. Yeah.
simple, brilliant.
And
And the
McCartney
other,
has credited George in recent years as
yes,
really
Right.
adding what it takes. But
Though
you
not
know,
officially.
you mentioned the instrumentation
yeah,
that changed from the electric version to the Latin version with the Spanish classical acoustic guitar,
yeah,
and what Harrison did with it. It's not just the fact that it's and with the bongos, it's a very Latin-esque sort of sound. But what he does, he goes he in the last verse.
hmm,
Remember that arpeggiation he does high on the neck. It's for the verse where the stars shine, and you just get that sort of very bright, sort of a twinkling sound from all of those individual pitches. I see the stars twinkling in the sky when George does that.
give you a
So
little bit of
yeah,
homework for fun. You don't have to wait till the box sets come out if you have this or you have it on CD. Listen to on the soundtrack the George Martin arrangement of "And I Love Her," and
Mhm.
listen to this professional studio musician guitarist playing the same part George Harrison plays, and tell
yeah,
me who plays it better. George nails it. It's
yeah,
boring by the professional musician because it doesn't have any vibrato. He's just playing the notes.
yeah.
True.
Yeah, George, if I had the guitar here, I could show you, what George does with his left hand. It's such beautiful, beautiful, sensitive playing. He was a big Segovia fan. He listened
Mhm.
to a lot of classical guitar playing. Um, yeah, that might have been, was that Vic Flick playing electric guitar on the George Martin
I'm not,
arrangement?
I'm not sure who George Martin used on it. I just know that
Mm.
it was
Yeah.
demon dull compared to
Oh,
George.
yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Yeah.
See, these are the things that we need to talk about because unfortunately, I think that the average person out there, unless they're music majors, they're not going to know what a minor ninth is in a song or anything like that.
Mhm.
But you talk about tension in a song. I mean, I'm a music major from the past and I know music theory, and there's some things that I can point out that I think are very unique on Beatle records.
Mhm.
Whether that translates to the average person as something really fascinating and making this early music more worthwhile, that's up to the individual. But I look at things like, well, we're going to get into the later stuff, but let me just bring up Not a Second Time,
Mhm.
because in the song, in the very beginning, John sings, You Made Me Cry. Um, what's the next line? It's for you.
Wondering why.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. What a
Ain't no
wonderful,
reason to change mine, right?
whatever. But later on, he adds to the line,
Yeah.
You made me cry. Da 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 da. Why I cry. He didn't do
Mhm.
that in the first verse.
Uh,
And
Little
something
things
else
like
he
that
does,
I noticed that are just very different.
uh-huh.
other things that John sometimes does, and they're unintentional, at least I think they are, is that John didn't really like double tracking. And sometimes when he's double tracking his voice, he's not matching it. And it
Mhm.
makes for some fun little differences, particularly toward the end of the song when you can tell he's getting a little tired with this double tracking.
Yeah. Especially in the outros
Mhm.
if they're improvising. And that's a good example of that, right? Not a second time. He's
Yeah.
singing two completely different melodies there. Yeah.
Usually everything is just repeated from the previous verses, but there's that little twist in there in that one song. And you talk about George's guitar solo in And I Love Her and having that Spanish feel and
Mhm.
think about Till There Was You, what he added
Yeah.
in there.
Oh, it's
That was
so
so
good.
unique as a
Absolutely.
guitar
Yeah.
solo for that
Mhm.
time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and totally original, completely original. Harrison doesn't often get credit for those kinds of things, those kinds of contributions. Like, take a song like Don't Let Me Down.
Hmm.
Um,
Mhm.
Everybody thinks of it as a Lennon song, but if you listen to all the recordings of how that song came into being. In the bridge, uh, there's a in the bridge, McCartney and Harrison double the same tune. Uh, like it begins like that. Um, and it's gorgeous all the way through. And I thought, oh, okay, so Paul must have written that as a bass line, and Harrison wanted to double it. But no, it's Harrison who came up with it. You hear him bit by bit creating that line, and and then McCartney gives up what he had wanted to do on the bass to
Go
double
back,
because he
when you're
loved it.
talking about George, let's go back to this time period we're talking about
Yeah,
with You Can't Do That.
yeah.
That's another song where George Martin says, that's good, John, but it needs an introduction. And George on his 12 string, which sounds sort of like your organ, says, well, what about this? Da, 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 da. And he does that. And the interesting thing about that song is the tension of George playing the riff and John, who's playing the lead guitar on the song and does the solo. Talk about tension in the middle of that song.
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. It's that. Um, I think Lennon might be playing a sharp. If he's not playing a sharp nine chord in there, there's something in between what he and George are doing on guitars that have that clash
Oh,
to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
it makes a
So,
song.
Al, how
Mhm.
do you feel about this particular topic? And do you think, as I have, and these two guys have, that this early period is not really appreciated that much?
I think let's put it that way. Well, first of all, I completely disagree with your friend saying that the early period sounds the music from the early period sounds like oldies, whereas the later period sounds like it could be done today.
Uh-huh.
Actually, especially material from say 66, 67 are very much of their time.
Mhm.
Whereas, barring any sort of technical issues, the early material, especially the material on with the Beatles slash Meet the Beatles, Hard Day's Night, Beatles for Sale, Help.
55.
Could be again with barring any technical issues, they sound very very current.
Hmm. I
You know,
think
Sure,
everyone
they
has a
don't
different
sound
opinion about
they
this.
don't sound dated. You
no,
listen to that and you go, oh my God, this is, yeah, look, Inagata Davida sounds dated. I mean, I like
yes,
it, but it sounds dated.
That's
right,
right.
Nobody's gonna say anything of these early Beatles songs sound dated. They're
mhm,
classics.
right.
It's the old cartoon where a guy, walks into the record store and he says, where are the Beatles records? And the guy says, over there in the classical records department.
Well,
Yeah.
there are some people that might disagree with what you just said there, Bruce, because in terms of compositions, just in songwriting, He Loves You doesn't sound like anything that could be put out today. I Want to Hold Your Hand doesn't sound like anything that could be put out today.
That's
And
okay. That's the
the
problem
whole
with the music.
There's actually it's too complex, or not too complex, but it's much more complex than a lot of very popular music is today.
Mhm,
Popular music today focuses more on timbre, studio effects,
mhm,
um, than uh, than was even conceivable in 1963, 64.
right.
But the Beatles really opened the door for new sounds, new timbres, new tone colors, and of course studio experimentation. But even something as basic as lyric writing, um, the early by the division being through 1966 and 67 and after, there's really a lot of brilliant lyric writing
Mhm,
in those earlier albums, and I guess Revolver, but But going back to Help, even, I've just seen a face, which I have to remind myself it's on Help, not Rubber Soul, because the American releases I grew up on. But, I've just seen a face as, McCartney is a brilliant wordsmith. And I think of his father once telling him, his father was a big crossword puzzle fanatic. And his father once told him, Paul, when you write words, you have to taste them. You have to feel the texture. You have to really have a very close relationship with the words. And I think McCartney, not always, but when he wanted to, he could write a great lyric. So I've got it. I've just seen a face written out here. And listen to the rhyme scheme here. I've just seen a face. I can't forget the time or place where we just met. She's just the girl for me, and I want all the world to see we've met. And met goes back to forget from the first line. So it's a very complex rhyme scheme, and all the verses work that way. It's no accident, right? Had it been another day, look the other way, and I'd never been aware, but I'll dream of her tonight. Tonight rhymes with and I tonight. I mean, take that, Richard Rodgers, pretty good lyric writing. And then you've got in Revolver, you've got Lennon going back to thinking about, I've never heard this mentioned, but I can only imagine he was going back to the English poetry he had studied as a kid, as a rebellious kid, but it made its mark. He wrote in iambic pentameter the same meter that Shakespeare and Milton and all the great English poets, English, Welsh, and Scottish and Irish poets have written in. But turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. Right? Lay down all thoughts, surrender to the void. It's iambic pentameter, and you could, read it in Shelley or Pope or anything. If I could do another one, Eleanor Rigby, McCartney. There was, I think Lennon gave McCartney a lot of grief for the way the lyrics were written for the last verses for that song. Lennon said, how dare he throw it out in the air, asking Mal if he had any ideas for the lyrics and so on. But whoever came up with the suggestions, it ends up being brilliant. So Eleanor Rigby picks up the rice, and the rice is on the highest pitch in that phrase. And then in the next phrase, waits at the window, wearing the face. They're not exactly rhymes, but the assonance there. And so you get a phrase where it says, wear the wedding, and waits at the window wearing, right? All the W's create the assonance that give the image a homogeneity, a unity about it that makes for, it creates an image, it creates a picture in your mind. Even better is the sound, writing the words of a sermon, working and darning in church and buried, dirt, the grave, right? It's a different color than all the W sounds were in the early verse. So McCartney, the craft, and I could go on about musical craft forever, but even just in the lyrics themselves, it's brilliant and it works. You don't have to have known Shakespeare. You don't have to know its iambic pentameter to feel the pull of those lyrics, when especially set over a drone of a tambura and just an unchanging chord over that unchanging bass, that unchanging meter in the poetry is I think very effective. Another thing about it, Tomorrow Never Knows and Eleanor Rigby, aside from the iambic pentameter, every line has like a short little tag in it. So you have turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. It is not dying. Now, those tags at the end of every line are not iambic pentameter. But in Eleanor Rigby, you get the reverse. You get the short little tag at the beginning, Eleanor Rigby, and then this long phrase, picks up the rice at the church where the wedding is being, right? Waits at the window, a short little thing. You could almost imagine, turn off your mind, relax, and float downstream. Father Mackenzie. The two songs are almost bookends of each other in the poetry. I think.
You go to the way back, to even the early stuff, and I have to listen to it a lot. Like that's a rough deal. It was a lot of fun doing it when I was doing the books on Please Please Me and With the Beatles and A Hard Day's Night. But just the little touches. And the Beatles themselves said, well, they, listening to those first albums, they weren't entirely satisfied with them anymore because they were hearing little things they could do and they weren't going to be rushed and they were going to take their time now. But what you notice when they're able to go with the, going from 2-track to all of a sudden now we've got 4-track is the use of percussion and just the little touches and the nice little effects that they make on the songs. Very subtle things, a little tambourine here and there, or, you're listening to, from Help, you've got to hide your love away. And of course you hear the tambourine, but also there's a shaker in there too. And it's kind of this, really nice little effect. Or you talk about tension, Ringo's drumming's on Help, he's fairly straightforward. And then all of a sudden you get to that last thing is, that ba, 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 and it's just amazing the little touches that all of these songs have, even going back though to the very first albums, every song, something jumps out at you as, oh yeah, that was really a nice little touch that they made here. And that's, what I love about them still, is even today, you go back and you hear A Hard Day's Night again, and you're like, oh yeah, that's right. That has that cowbell 4 on the bar, but only for that part of the song. Whereas the bongos are throughout, little things like that. Like, okay, why did they do it that way? I don't know, but it's very effective that way.
Yeah, and listening to the Red album, the new remix, it struck me. I mean, that's the amazing thing. You can hear these songs thousands of times and still discover something new.
Absolutely.
But they used hand claps a lot.
Sure.
And that really made a difference in some of those songs, like Certainly I Want to Hold Your Hand.
I'll Get You.
Obviously, 8 days a week.
Especially the Please Mr. Postman clap, right?
Yeah.
Man, yeah.
Yeah.
Beatles use that in so much of their music, so many songs.
And one of the things about the Beatles, in a way, it was unfortunate they were so prolific in their songwriting because we missed out on getting more great cover versions, I mean, I loved the Marvelettes version of Please Mr. Postman. It was one of the 45s that my sisters had bought, and when they weren't around, I would quote, borrow their record player and move it into my room. And I would constantly play that song. And as much as I loved it, when I heard the Beatles version of it, it was, wow, this is even better. And I think the weird thing, and Walter, if I'm right on this, I think that they don't quite do it as fast as the Marvelettes, but for some reason,
you're absolutely right. Yeah,
but it sounds faster for some reason. I don't know why, but when I compare them, I'm like, well, wait a minute. The Beatles version sounds faster, but it's not. It's more exciting.
Motown had so many formulas. So many of their songs are quarter note are at 128 beats per minute. So I don't. So Postman might be in that slot. So many of the Supreme songs are, but yeah, the Beatles didn't have any kind of, they weren't clock watchers, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And, I mean, I just wish that, thank God we have that BBC stuff and maybe some of the lesser things can be cleaned up a little better, but, just the classic rock and roll stuff that they did. And I still tell people, for my money, if somebody asked me, what are the two greatest rock and roll vocals of all time? I'd say Twist and Shout, John Lennon and the Beatles, and then Long Tall Sally, Paul McCartney, the
Yeah,
Beatles.
yeah.
And
Tough to beat 'em.
I don't know. Can you name one that's better? I can't.
Not really.
It could
I'm
just
down
be
pretends to the throne, doesn't it?
Mhm.
I'm down. McCartney is trying to be Little Richard there.
Oh,
Mhm.
Well,
absolutely.
you know what a great album is the Hamburg stuff from December 1962, right?
Mhm.
If that could be cleaned up,
It
that's
can
what Peter
be, and one
Jackson should
day,
be working
please,
on.
will be.
Yeah, because that's an incredible rock band. It really is.
Peter Jackson. We all want you to work on it,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
but you got to get Apple's approval for that.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's one thing. You listen to live at the BBC, especially the first one, and all those songs the Beatles covered could have ended up on their albums
Mhm.
Yeah.
easily. So sometimes I wonder how they got to pick just those songs. Like there's six covers on Please Please Me, six on With the Beatles, six on Beatles for Sale. Why those ones? Because all the other ones they did so well too.
Yeah.
You know?
I think
And
with the Please Please Me album, a number of those covers were recent additions to the repertoire, right? I think Anna
Mhm.
and Chains uh, had the originals had come out not too long before
Right.
they recorded that, so they had just been added to their repertoire, I think.
Yeah. Whereas the covers that are on Beatles for Sale are all, for the most part, classic rock um, tunes that they had been doing in the clubs
Right.
and ballrooms for several years before their own breakthrough.
Hmm.
Mhm.
You know, one of the things that I think hurts the Beatles is that um, all this music, this early stuff, sounds like it's simple, but it's very deceptive.
Mhm.
And to a lot of people that don't really study music and they're so impressed with the later Beatles, they look at the early stuff as too poppy,
They're a
whereas they
boy
rocked
band.
more.
The
What's
boy
that?
Yeah.
band. They're a
Right.
boy band.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So it's hard to, if you're not educated on that catalog and you don't really study it, to really teach people what they're doing. That's just so different. You know, another thing that they did that was very innovative was in the harmony work.
Mhm.
I have a wife who studies harmony. That's the most important thing. It's one of the things she fell in love with the Beatles for. Once she heard If I Fell, that was it.
Yeah.
But you know, she told me that the harmonies on 8 Days a Week are very different
Yeah.
from what most bands would do. And a lot of that they got from the Everly Brothers because their
Mhm.
harmonies were not typical. You know, Beach Boy stuff is far more typical. You know, it's like barbershop
Yeah.
quartet
For
harmonies.
freshmen
Right. For a freshman.
was
Right.
yeah.
I
So
mean, I'm glad you mentioned that, the Everly Brothers clearly, and then also, um, I just don't understand and, and
Mm.
things like that. And, that's not the Everly Brothers, but the same basic idea of, you're talking about the songcraft. Um, and song, the one that they did by the Crickets, I'm blanking on the name
Please don't
title.
ever
Don't ever
change. Don't
change.
ever
Don't ever
change.
Yeah.
change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't ever change. And the Everly Brothers, that's where the harmonies come from,
Yes.
clearly. Don't Ever Change. When I first heard Don't Ever Change, I thought it was an Everly Brothers song.
Mhm.
Yeah, I always like
Yeah.
to bring up WABC.
Well,
Lundy. Lundy.
Bruce, and I'm
Oh,
sorry.
I
Go
just
ahead,
wanted
Ken.
to say that one of the legendary DJs on WABC in New York was Ron Lundy. And he said
Yeah.
when he first heard the Beatles, he thought that they were four Everly Brothers.
Yeah. Yeah. Ron Lundy, he was on before Cousin Brucey, I think, or Dan
Yes, he
Harrison.
was.
Dan Harrison.
Well, actually,
Dan Ingram.
right before
Getting them
Dan
mixed up.
Ingram. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But that song, "Please Don't Ever Change," the vocal harmonies, the chorus, right?
Mm.
That that's where the Beatles got the bridge for "I'll Get You," right? What is think it's, right? I, it's the same rhythm, the same two-part. It doesn't sound, you can't tell on the organ, but if I had a couple of singers here, you'd say, "Oh yeah, the crickets, I'll get you." It's the same trick there. Yeah.
Thing that I love about I'll Get You is they're obviously that last verse, John and Paul are singing different things.
Yeah.
But the performance is so good that George Martin just fine, we'll go with it. And the other amazing thing about the song, and it shows you the brilliance of the Beatles, is that 45, She Loves You, I'll Get You. So you go back into a market where the Beatles are virtually unknown, and in WORC in Worcester, Massachusetts, Dick the Derby Smith gets the She Loves You single and he's playing it, and their surveys are based on requests only. And She Loves You, pre-Beatlemania in the US, is number 10 on the charts. And people go, wow, that's really cool. And I go, well, what was number one? And they're like, oh, Dominique, or yeah. I said, I'll Get You was number one.
Mm.
And that just blows me away that in a place where people really didn't know who the Beatles were, a Beatles B-side was the number one requested song on this radio station. That shows you the quality of even the B-sides of these early recordings.
There were a couple of stations in the Northeast, in Buffalo, as well as in Worcester. I don't think Albany, but a couple of those stations, and maybe one of the stations in Toronto, not CKLW, but somewhere in Ontario.
Like WKBW in Buffalo, I think.
Maybe, yeah, that's right. They got on the train pretty early, and with She Loves You, that got some play in a town called was it St. Joseph, Illinois? It was not too far across the river from where Louise Harrison lived, and you could get not all, but so many thousands and thousands of radio surveys, week by week surveys all across the country and some foreign markets online. And I've wondered, I know Louise Harrison supposedly made phone calls pitching the first few Beatles singles to radio stations, and I wonder if she went as far afield as across the river in
I don't know about that. I know that
rural
what gave her
Missouri.
difficulty with From Me to You was the Del Shannon cover version.
Yeah.
And one station in particular wrote her back a letter, and the letter stated, well, it's, we've already started playing the Del Shannon version. So, we're not going to change horses in midstream type deal.
Yeah.
And, and that was kind of unfortunate, that way. But what I don't quite understand is the Beatles, these early records did get some airplay, but they really didn't do anything, even with the fact they were getting that limited airplay. And it's mystifying that people were hearing these songs and didn't go, oh my God, this is great. I mean, Please Please Me was getting airplay in Chicago in February, and it made the top 40, but it translated into national sales of about 5,000 units, which was clearly a flop. Paul's own words.
Yeah, that's surprising considering it's Chicago. It's the number 3 market, but it was at the bottom of their top 40.
Yeah.
Was that VJ distribution problems at that point, or?
Awesome. No, not quite at that point.
Yeah.
Well,
It's just kind of, but you have to look at, when we talk about top 40, pretty much everything in that top 40 was great. I mean, it was varied, but I mean, today, I couldn't, you could play me the top 10 songs, and if I recognize 2 or 3, I'll be impressed with myself. But back then, there were some great songs that didn't, become big hits, except in local markets. And that's was the fun part about it. I mean, take a group, getting a little bit further in 68, the Nas with Todd Rundgren, Hello, It's Me. That was a number 1 or 2 hit in New Orleans.
And Philadelphia, I'm sure.
Yeah, probably the only 2 places in the country.
Yeah.
And then, you had I Love You by People was a number 1 hit in New Orleans, but probably nowhere else. you know, the Great Zombie song that wasn't a hit, but people made it a big hit. And, you know, you had those things. And that's what I tell people about how exciting radio was in those days, because one disc jockey in one part of this country could make a hit single somehow. Whereas today, you know, you get Clear Channel and everything is, you know, people are playing more or less the same thing across the country. And you don't have that chance where one disc jockey can really make a difference unless he's with some big corporation. And that's kind of a shame.
And even then,
Still,
they're really most disc jockeys now either are not allowed to pick any of the music, or they're on, you know, they're just voice tracking, and so they don't even have the music in front of them. They're just basically reading, in effect, reading liner cards.
I mean,
Well,
the thing that also,
the role of radio, I think, has a lot to do with this division of early and late Beatles, because you know, with Dylan and a few other artists, but of course with Rubber Soul and Revolver, the album itself became the medium for rock music, whereas before that it was all the single and it was AM radio. FM wasn't a thing until mid 60s.
even with the Beatles, I distinctly remember in 1964, after the Sullivan Show, when it was obvious that Ringo was the most popular Beatle in America, I would hear, you know, I want to hold your hand. I mean, I don't want to, I mean, I want to be your man on WTIX AM on a pretty regular basis. And that was obviously an album track. You look at the WABC playlist charts, and they're full of album tracks. And that hadn't been done really before the Beatles.
Yeah.
well,
No,
there were radio stations that played the entire Meet the Beatles album.
Yeah.
And it was on their charts like it was a hit record.
I've seen that before.
Yeah.
You know, like number 2 on the charts is the Beatles' second album this week.
Right.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah.
But you know, you talk about radio. I know Al has heard me talk about this a lot, but since radio has been the primary way to promote music through all these years, when classic rock radio developed, there seemed to be this fine line between 1967 and everything else. Everything started in 1967. Sgt. Pepper was out that year. Jimi Hendrix, Are You Experienced, Surrealistic Pillow, The Doors' first album. And with the exception of if you had a specialty program, like a weekend Beatles show where they might play earlier Beatles, part of the regular diet of classic rock radio, they wouldn't play anything pre-1967. You had to have a reason to play music like that. So they're kind of setting the tone for what still deserves to get airplay. And I guess because the music then changed so much and the album became more of an art form, which to me is kind of ridiculous, because the first Beatles album, whether it's you go by the British album or the American album, the songs are so solid all throughout. It is an art, the albums that they put out. But as far as like a theme like Sgt. Pepper, that was relatively new. But you know, I just feel like for all these years, year after year of not hearing music on a format like that, and such a popular format as classic rock radio. And just look at why do they divide the red and the blue, 62 to 66, 67 to 70? It's like there is this real dividing line. Like was there that big a difference between 66 and 67? I mean, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper is a more produced version of what they were doing on Revolver.
Right.
You know, they were expanding so much musically and breaking out with so many different musical genres. They really exploded in experimentation with Revolver in particular, and Sgt. Pepper carried on with that, but produced a lot more.
I think the demarcation line, it really does have to be 60, or the end of 66, beginning of 67, because that was the end of the touring years. The end of, say, if you want to call it that, the Beatlemania years. Whereas beginning with Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields, and then Sgt. Pepper, it's a whole different chapter of their development.
I mean, it's a
Talking
natural
about
place.
the music alone, not just
No,
the
I understand that, but even the music alone, it's a natural place to say this is a big leap. But by the
Mhm.
same token, that doesn't mean everything before it isn't important. I mean,
Right.
it's all important.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And that's the thing that gets me. I mean, like I said, if the Beatles had broken up in 1965 or 6, you'd be talking about, their brilliant albums, Meet the Beatles and the Beatles' second album and the music in A Hard Day's Night, because it is. I mean, I don't know if I entirely agree with John. He says, well, like what Ticket to Ride's the first heavy metal single, but Ticket to Ride is certainly different sounding than anything on the
Mhm.
radio then.
Oh
And then,
gosh.
and then you get to Rain. Maybe Rain's the first heavy metal single for my money.
Mhm.
It's got that heavy sound to it. But I mean, this stuff is also brilliant. And, bear in mind what a teen album was in those days
Mhm.
before the Beatles. It was one or two hit singles and for the
Right.
most part filler.
Mhm.
And that meant cover versions of other stuff or songs nobody really wanted to do, but the A&R guy, made you do it.
Yeah.
Whereas when you got to that Beatles album, I remember as a kid, I think, and a single could be as much as $1 and an album was $3. So if
Mhm.
an album had 3 songs on it, I was getting my money's worth.
Hmm.
And you listen to a Beatles album and it was like every song is good. You didn't get up and lift the needle because you didn't want to hear the next couple of tracks. That was the difference with those Beatle albums, and they don't get enough credit for that. What they did, and sales wise, it showed. The forecast sales for Meet the Beatles were 250,000 units. Why? Because the Beach Boys and the non-special Christmas and gospel whatever albums by Elvis sold about 250,000 units. So the Beatles were going to sell 250,000 units in America. And all of a sudden, in 2 to 3 months, Meet the Beatles has sold 3.6 million units. Hey,
Mhm.
record company, carefully crafted albums can sell many, many copies. And they got the message. It took some record companies a year or two or so to get the message. Because even you
Mhm.
listen to the Dave Clark Five and the Hollies and the Animal albums, that stuff's full of a lot of filler.
Absolutely.
Not so with the Beatles.
Yeah. I recently heard some Gen Z girl on a podcast, and she's saying that she doesn't think I forget whether it was with the Beatles or Meet the Beatles, but she says that whichever one it was, it's not a good collection of songs, which is the biggest load of poppycock I've ever heard. Because I mean, that is, as Bruce has pointed out, and in fact, probably we all have, that album Meet the Beatles, particularly, was the absolute perfect introduction
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
the American audience.
Yeah, and if
And
I were stuck on a desert island with Beatles 6, I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
couldn't be happier, you know? It's yeah, so much of the early work is just brilliant in so many ways. But getting back to 67 and the progression from Revolver, I have to say, I think Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields, and Pepper were a new, not as much a new direction, but a new peak
Mm-hmm.
that they hadn't achieved before that. But looking back, I mean, there are so many indicators on Revolver of where they were headed. It's just that the all the time the experimentation that they had, the freedom, the flexibility to try so many different things. I mean, for Lucy in the Sky, they spent a whole day just trying to figure out what the instrumentation was going to be and what stops
Mm-hmm.
on the Lowry organ were going to work best. And um, they never could have done that even as recently as Rubber Soul or Revolver, I don't think. And there's and it's a new intro. Yes, Revolver was a new beginning, you know, Mark One and the starting off 1, 2, 3, 4 for
Mm-hmm.
Taxman, just like I saw her standing there, except it was a little trippier. But Pepper is a brand new way that the Beatles related to their audience, right? The audience is on the album, right? You can hear the audience on the album. And at the same time, they were never further from their audience. They were never further from themselves, right? McCartney created this persona of a fake band because it would free his imagination and he wouldn't be trapped into doing the things that McCartney would want to do. And so you have this artificial band, but the audience is right there with them, you know, in a new way that had never been done before. And for me, it's just a new start. And they soon realized after Magical Mystery Tour continued in that direction that they couldn't top it. I mean, nobody could top it, in my opinion.
There's some people who think that Abbey Road is their best album. So,
Oh, in some ways it is, absolutely. I mean, technically, it's
Sounding
tighter.
album.
What's that?
It's the best
Bruce?
sounding album.
Yes.
Yeah.
It
Oh,
just,
yeah.
it just so comes through those speakers so clean and everything.
Right. Some of that is the solid state. You know, they had all new equipment for recording, new boards and everything. But the precision of performance, unmatched, absolutely precise all the way through, in ways that you don't hear that attention. They didn't care about that craftsmanship on the White Album, for instance.
I always like to
didn't
bring
have
up
the time.
something that Giles Martin said a few years ago. Abbey Road is the only Beatles album that sounds like it could have been produced in the 70s.
Mm.
And he's right.
Sure.
Anyway.
Yeah.
But do you think that part of the reason why, again, there's more of an appreciation for the later stuff, and yes, I know the quality of the music is great, but does any of it have to do with the production and the sound of the Beatles as opposed to pre-67?
Somewhat, because you were talking about how classic rock radio really tends to heavily highlight the later Beatles. And it's probably because, programming wise, they feel that the sound of those early albums is inconsistent with the sound of classic rock radio or classic rock. You know, it doesn't, that something that Tell Me Why wouldn't really be consistent musically with Stairway to Heaven.
But say if you take the Red Album as it sounds now, you mean to tell me that Ticket to Ride wouldn't fit right in with classic rock? I mean, I think it would be perfect for it.
No question.
Yeah. And talk about dissonance, you know, Lennon singing right on you know, that pitch is not part of the chord. That pitch is not part of the chord, and that pitch is certainly not part of the chord. The tension in Ticket to Ride, and the story. I love the story of how that song came about. You know, McCartney was vacationing in Tunisia, and he heard this rhythm, bop 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 bop, taught it to Ringo, and that, I think, probably predated Harrison's riff on the 12 string, but Harrison would have written that riff to match the drumming that Ringo was doing, and Lennon just played the drone, the open A on his guitar through that until the chord changes. So all the layers of things going on there, all based on this Tunisian rhythm that McCartney was so excited about. It's a brilliant track and so innovative. I mean,
These boys
really
kind of ripped it off with "Girl Don't Tell Me."
Oh,
That's true.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
This is all interesting what we're covering here. You know, something that I always bring up all the time on the podcast shows, and I'm sure Al is aware of it. we bring up this whole idea about music being dated. And I know that, we talked about it a few moments ago.
Mhm.
Anytime I ask the question, why does it even matter? Nobody could ever give me an answer, because there are some people who feel that the only music that's worth listening to has to sound like it could have come out today and sound contemporary. And anything that sounds old, or maybe compositionally sounds old, it doesn't fit, the music of today. It's not worth their while, which I think is really ridiculous.
Mhm.
And because most of the music that's ever been recorded doesn't sound contemporary. So, you know, this is a big argument that I have with people. I mean, I can disagree with you guys about the compositions of the Beatles and the fact that a song like Please Please Me, nobody writes a song like Please Please Me or I Want to Hold Your Hand. I still love it the same way I did when I first heard it. There's no difference
Absolutely.
whatsoever.
Yeah.
But
Gonna get an
I will
argument with me
agree
on
that
that.
nobody writes songs like that today. It doesn't fit what the kind of music is that's out today.
But you still get some
And
groups that are recording stuff in that style.
mhm.
Like the Weaklings, you listen to some of their stuff and it's right out of right out of the 60s, early 60s Beatles style. And I don't mean that in a negative way,
No,
you know?
Fountains of
And-
Wayne, a lot of power pop
Yeah,
right.
yes.
is very redolent of mid-period Beatles, say.
yeah.
Yeah.
And Ken, you mentioned Please Please Me, and about, say, influence of older music. I mean, Please Please Me, John Lennon admitted that the inspiration for Please Please Me was a song by Bing Crosby from
Right.
1931 called Please.
Right.
And so it's they had grown up listening to that type of music.
Hey, I put on records of thousand-year-old music
Sure.
occasionally,
Yeah.
So
Sure.
uh, everybody's got different tastes, and
Mhm.
it might be fun to argue, but there's no accounting for taste, really. It's an old saw, but it's true, and a lot of people love best the music that they listened to when they were teens and in their 20s. That sticks with them in ways that other music can't get to. And the story, the image of the grumpy old people who, boy, they don't make music like they used to.
Right.
Mhm.
There's so many different attitudes about musical taste, but there's always been great music. There's great music coming out today. And I like Brandy Carlisle. She's one of my favorite
Mhm.
singers. Yeah. So I mean, there's all kinds of stuff from every period of music production that's
Part
good
of the
and bad.
reason, I think part of the reason though the early Beatles stuff sounds so fresh and exciting today was, the way it was recorded on those earlier ones was, look, you get in there and you're singing and playing at the same time.
Mhm.
And the difference is, if you're recording and you get the music track and then you have the percussion, then you got the headphones on and you're doing the vocals. To me, all that layering, I think you kind of lose the excitement. I think, it's a lot easier. I mean, I know Paul did a great job on Oh Darling, which was done the latter way, but for the most part, I think one of the things that makes it so great is it's being sung live in the studio, as it were. And I
Mhm.
think it's more exciting that way. And you get away from it where sometimes these songs, they almost sound like, I hate to pick on one group, but like say Wilson Phillips, it sounds homogenized.
Mm.
There's nothing wrong with what they're doing, but you can tell there's a backing track and they're singing vocals over it, as opposed to they're out there slamming it out together, at the same time in a studio that has a little bit of natural echo in it. And that's to me what makes the early song so exciting. And you're right, maybe the only way you could do it today would literally go back to a place like Gold Star or Abbey Road and go in there and say, okay, we're going to record it live. We may do some overdubs, but basically we're going to sing and play at the same time. And if I screw up one or two bass notes on a 3-minute performance, who the hell cares? You
Hmm.
know, if
Well,
I miss a note somewhere, who the hell cares?
well,
It's the performance.
Well, Frank Sinatra always preferred to basically do it live, to be right in the middle of the orchestra surrounding him in the Capitol Studios
Yeah.
in the 50s, and do it all live at once, rather than have to have overdubs or anything like that, which is ironic because at the end, near the end of his life, he did 2 albums of duets where he was never in the studio with the person he was duetting with.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, Paul has brought up upon occasion that when he goes into making certain new albums, he likes to try to remember it the way the Beatles did it, where they go into the studio and in one day they might have 3 songs done all in one day. He liked the immediacy of that, and that's captured on those records. And I think that is part of the appeal of a lot of that music too. But I also seem to think that in this day and age, and certainly I like to bring up this whole Revolver versus Sergeant Pepper aspect of it, because Revolver has now been really revered so heavily, and a lot of the 90s bands point to Revolver more so than Sergeant Pepper as a real influence on their music. There are a lot of fans out there that like less production, keep it raw, keep it simple. The playing is great. If the playing is great and the songs are great, they prefer that. Whereas Sergeant Pepper is kind of, it's one of the greatest albums of all time, but to some people it's bloated, with production. I would never say it's overproduced, but I think we're living in a time where people like simpler production. They like acoustic stuff. They like stripped down. They like demos of recordings. Look at all these box sets. People find all that stuff really interesting. And, that's the trend of today. I don't know how it's going to be 10 years from now, but I think that's part of why. And see, here's a problem. We're talking about the later stuff being accepted so much more, and yet Sergeant Pepper to some people is very dated. So, and keep in mind one thing, when I say dated, that's not a dirty word to me. There's so much music that I love that sounds dated. It doesn't have any bearing as to whether or not I still love it,
I think it's Sergeant Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour as well are kind of its time. They're very much 1967 in a way that, Meet the Beatles does not scream out 1964. Certainly A Hard Day's Night, which Steve Van Zandt has called his all-time favorite album. It's, that album does not scream out 1964 in the way that, as I said, Sergeant Pepper is probably, not that there's anything wrong with that.
Yeah.
But it is of its time, particularly because of the impact that it made in that summer of 67.
But
Yeah,
then
I
you
think
don't
you're
know
right. Right, Al. I mean, there was so much social change in
Yes,
'67, right?
that too. Yeah.
The beginnings of youth culture turning everything upside down, and certainly psychedelics, and uh, just so many social changes in that year that that um, the albums, all the albums of '67, what the Stones were doing, what the Zombies did in '67, Odyssey and Oracle, and R&B, Aretha Franklin, so much stuff of '67, and pop stuff, Incense and Peppermints, and so on and so forth. The Rascals. It's definitely of its time in a way that earlier stuff wasn't, just because that time was very self-conscious about change. I think, you know, I know in times, the Changin Times, your book, Al, you talk about the social changes that have been purported to lead to the Beatles' great popularity, and you debunk that completely, talking
Right.
about their music being
Hmm.
absolutely supreme in what made them so popular. And so I think you're right. I don't think, those albums are tied to that year and the events of that year, the way 1967
Hmm.
music was.
Absolutely.
So that
Oh,
hurts
wait,
the music?
yeah, and I wanted to say that, Walter, you mentioned one of my favorite non-Beatles songs of all time, Incense and Peppermints.
Oh, it's great.
Great, great song.
Yeah. And
Particularly on
I
that
can't,
little break, that dunk dunk, perfectly timed.
yeah, right. And I can't believe that guy went into Leonard Skinner, right? Wasn't it Leonard Skinner he joined? From the South someplace. Now I can't remember his name. Blanking on it. But oh yeah, that's a great track. Absolutely.
Hmm.
Like I always tell Al, one of my favorite, you know, John Lennon songs that John Lennon never did with the Beatles would be Lies by the Knickerbockers.
Uh, yeah. Oh yeah. Very, very Beatley, isn't it?
Hmm.
Uh-huh.
That seems to be in everybody's top five of most Beatlesque sounding songs.
Absolutely.
But there's so many bands, especially since the Beatles broke up,
Hmm.
were so influenced by them,
Sure.
especially in the power pop
Yeah.
field. But
Hmm.
yeah, but do you think that when music is so tied to a specific year, that really hurts the music?
No,
No.
not at all. Not
No.
at all. And for me, it doesn't matter if you understand the social implications or not. I mean, it's the values in the music itself are wonderful. If you can contextualize it a bit, that helps your appreciation of it, I suppose. But it doesn't hurt for me at all. Um, no, I don't think so. I mean, you think about the Woodstock performances, say. I mean, you hear all of those live recordings, even the ones you don't hear all the time, John Sebastian, say, or Sly and the Family Stone,
Hmm.
whatever. I mean, you instantly think of Woodstock when you hear the Woodstock soundtrack
Yeah.
recordings. But uh, you don't have to know about that concert or the festival to enjoy, Crosby, Stills, and Nash. My gosh,
Hmm.
let alone Hendrix. So,
But with
You
every
know,
musical period, there's still music like we talk about 67, and I've said this about Jimi Hendrix. I think he was from another stratosphere. You
Hmm.
know, that sounds like he could have recorded that today, what he was doing in
oh
67.
yeah, yeah.
I think the Doors music sounds very fresh to me. You know,
Hmm.
I never hear the Jefferson Airplane anymore being played on the radio, unfortunately. But there's some music from every period that still sounds contemporary and some that sounds old. And I love it all the same. But, you know, I just think sometimes there's too much of an emphasis on what sounds fresh and contemporary,
Hmm.
pushing aside all the other music.
Yeah.
So,
prejudices where people, still a lot of times will say, well, we can't listen to the Monkees because they didn't play their own instruments. And I remember, I guess it was before the Monkees had their big 20th reunion. I kept telling people this Monkees music is going to make a big comeback
hmm,
because it sounds as good today as it did in 66, 67, 68. These are brilliant songs, well written, well played, well sung. And it still is. I mean,
Hmm.
it's fun when you listen to that stuff and you realize how great those recordings were for what they were. How can you? It's like if I wake up in the morning and I'm not in a really good mood, I will grab, the Monkees CD and pop it in the CD player. And how can you arrive at work in a bad mood listening to the Monkees? You can't.
well, it's like I always say, the most important thing is the quality of the song first. And I'm
Yes.
Yes.
not I'm not denying the importance of production, but production isn't nearly as I'd rather have a song that's a great song that's produced lousy than have a song that's not a good song that's produced wonderfully.
I
You know?
remember when I interviewed Alan Livingston for my earlier books, and he was talking about, he signed, which at the time was this massive deal with the Beatles. And EMI over in England was like, telling him, Alan, there's no guarantee the Beatles are going to keep being like this and all. And, why do you have this faith in the Beatles? And he said, because the songwriting is so great.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what attracted him to the Beatles. With Frank Sinatra, the reason he urged Capitol to sign Frank Sinatra was the guy has a great voice. So you look at the Beatles, though, and they had not only the great songwriting, but they had the great voices too. And that's what, really made it unique. As much as John Lennon didn't like his voice, which I can't believe today, you listen to a Beatles song from any period, I don't care what period it is, his voice is incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just so much to his voice. Sometimes he's got that raw sound to it, sometimes that tender sound. But all these early Beatle tracks, you can just hear how wonderful his voice is. It just blows me away that this guy didn't like the sound of his voice.
And they had 3 lead vocalists,
Yeah.
which in that
don't overlook Ringo.
well,
Ringo,
that's true too.
Ringo's
Very true.
as what was said, I think it was what Derek Taylor on one of the liner notes to that EP said, Ringo doesn't sing often but well, which is better than singing often and rotten.
Yeah.
Some people that actually thought Ringo's, rock and roll type singing was some of the best vocals that were being done by the Beatles. When you would read some of the letters to these magazines, why don't they let Ringo sing more? He's a great rock and roll singer.
Charming,
They had
for sure.
4 vocalists, and if you listen to Abbey Road, some of those tracks, it's, John isn't there, and it's Ringo, George, and Paul singing the parts. Very underrated vocalist.
Yeah. And if you look at the catalog from Please Please Me through Let It Be, I think it's 11 songs that Ringo sings lead vocals on. It's 11 or 12. How many groups
that
have
many? Interesting. Yeah.
how many groups have a 4th lead singer sing that many songs in a band?
Yeah, John Entwistle got 1 or 2 tracks, right? Boris the Spider.
Boris the Spider, yeah. My wife, maybe.
Yeah. But yeah, they had 4 lead vocalists, and all 4 of them have very different sounding vocals, and blending together, they were amazing.
Yeah.
And it made it more interesting how their vocals were different, each of the 4 of them.
Sure.
And the other thing too, on those early recordings, once you get past Love Me Do, you realize what a great drummer Ringo is. He sounds a little tentative on Love Me Do, but you get past that, and his drumming is just incredible. And you get these morons who, well, John said Ringo wasn't even the best drummer in the Beatles, which John never said. But the bottom line is, it's fun when somebody says that. Give them a pair of drumsticks, have them sit behind a set, and name a couple of songs and see what they can do. In particular, ask them to play Rain at the slow pace, much less the pace it was recorded.
Yeah.
That's
I'm
true.
amazed that it was recorded that quickly as a song.
Has any cover band
I know.
Has any cover band done that yet? Because I keep trying to get Liverpool to say, do Rain at the correct speed or the recorded speed.
I think all the parts except the bass line could have been done at that fast tempo, but I suspect the bass might have been recorded slower. It just does not sound. It doesn't lie on the fingerboard right at that tempo. Just my own simple thinking, but I don't know. It doesn't work. I mean, they had to slow it down, right? They had to slow it down.
All right. So in closing here, this has all been fantastic comments that the 3 of you have brought. If you were just approaching a fairly new Beatles fan, and they like the later stuff a lot, and they don't really know the early music, how would you convince them that this music is just as worth their while as the later stuff?
I'm a copy of Meet the Beatles.
That's it?
I think that should be it. That doesn't do it, nothing will.
Yeah, I think that the singles and Rubber Soul, and if Revolver is considered an early album, it's hard for me to think that it is, but Certainly Rubber Soul as an album is, is one of the great early Beatle albums. Hard Day's Night is too. Tremendous. So many Lennon songs, fantastic. Performance
Let's
is great.
forget,
The engineering, Norman Smith does an incredible job on Hard Day's Night. The different timbres he gives to the guitars, it's so incredible. Just the mono mix, you listen to all the differences in all the different, just all the different colors that Norman Smith brings to it. It's an amazingly engineered album, I think.
yeah, he plays some
Listen-
mean bongos.
He does play mean bongos.
Right.
Listen to the melodies.
Mm.
Listen to songs like If I Fell, like Not a Second Time, like P.S. I Love You, as early a song as that.
Yeah.
So many of those songs. I've always said that the kind of the secret sauce that was one of the elements that made the Beatles so great was the melodies in those songs.
Mm-hmm.
Well, John, Paul, and George are three of the greatest melodic songwriters of all time. I think Ringo developed into a very good songwriter. But if you're a melody person like I am, and the three of you are, then how can you not admire the Beatles for all the great work that they did? But I always like to say that one of the fascinating things in studying the Beatles is the evolution from the very beginning to the end.
Yes.
And progress being made album to album. Now, if you're going from Please Please Me to With the Beatles, that's not as big a leap as Help to Rubber Soul or Rubber Soul to Revolver, but every single album represented some change and some development in them, either as songwriters or in their musicianship. So in order to get to point B, you needed point A first. You wouldn't have had Sgt. Pepper if you didn't have Revolver first. You wouldn't have had Magical Mystery Tour and the White Album if you didn't have Sgt. Pepper first. So if you love those albums, you really should investigate the early stuff.
And it really helps to appreciate what their schedule was in the years they were putting those albums together. All the touring, I mean, the number of shows they did a year, plus television and radio appearances, live radio and taped radio appearances, constantly interviews, constantly being approached by the press and photographers, and so many obligations. Every day they had several things scheduled. And to be able to fit in a few recording dates here and there when they could be in London, it's amazing what they put together in terms of recording in those years. It's just amazing.
It was amazing in the later years too.
Yeah. I'm doing a piece right now for Beatlefan on Beatles for Sale, Beatles 65, Beatles 6, which get a lot of crap from what I call the young'uns, the Gen X and younger fans, and how they recorded that album between an American tour, a British tour, a guest appearance on Shindig, BBC radio appearances, as you were just saying, Walter. It's the schedule they were undergoing at that time, and recording full albums during all of this was just amazing.
So you take one of these groups and say, okay, your mission is, and you don't have to do anything else. We're going to give you 1 year. And in this 1 year, we want you to record 2 albums and either 3 or 4 singles. We don't really care if it's 3 or 4. That's your mission. And by the way, we expect you to, for the most part, have original songs, but we'll allow you to do, when you do 14 songs, 6 of them can be cover versions. Have at it, guys. Good luck.
You know, with all that's said about Please Please Me, that 10 of the 14 songs were done in one day. Beatles for Sale, half the album was done in one day. There was like 7 songs plus the single.
At the very end.
Yeah. So that was really quick.
Sure.
Right there. But even in the later years, you look at 67, they put out Sergeant Pepper and Magical Mystery Tour. That's two albums right there, even though they were, previous singles with All I Need Is Love.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's still a lot of music in one year. 68, the Beatles were under contract to put out two albums for the White Album. So they had to really, in those few months, come up with a lot of songs. And granted, a lot of them they wrote in India, but still,
Mhm.
that's a lot of music in one year. Compare that to today, where an artist can take several years in between albums.
It's the thing of the pressure was the thing that would get you, for me, song
Mm.
for song, maybe their best collection of songs, and counting the two singles were the Rubber Soul sessions. And I mean, Paul, when they get back from the US tour, tells, Johnny Dean of the Beatles book, there's nothing in the cupboard. Well, there was, I guess, he resurrected Michelle. But I
Mhm.
mean, for the most part, they sat down there and came up with 16 songs in a less than a month's time because EMI said, thou shalt have a record out for Christmas,
Mhm.
and we want a single too, not just an album. So that means 16 songs. That's really working well under pressure.
All original.
Mhm. Yep.
That's pretty amazing.
Mhm.
Okay, so before we go, you guys want to talk about what you have planned? Let's just say Al for Beatlefan.
Well, I've got a piece coming up in the next issue on Give My Regards to Broad Street, which is 40 years old next month.
Okay.
And then, as I said, I'm just doing right now this piece on Beatles for Sale, and also I have two chapters in Bruce's book, in Bruce's Hard Day's Night book, as I've been doing with the Beatles album series, going back to the Sergeant Pepper book.
Mm-hmm. And also Pierce Hemmingson makes a contribution. Bill
Right, and Bill
Frank
King
Daniels.
and Frank Daniels.
Mm-hmm.
That would be great. Be great.
All right. Bruce, okay,
Yeah.
you can hold up that book
Speaking
again.
of, Al was talking about the book, and it's called The Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, and More. And for those of you looking forward to the vinyl box set, my essays are about 1,600 words, maybe. These books have a lot more than 1,600 words. And so what I tell people is, if you want that first phase of Beatlemania, this book, Please Please Me to With the Beatles, coupled with this book, The Beatles, A Hard Day's Night, and More, will give you that first phase of Beatlemania. It takes you
Mhm.
all the way up through November of 64. So we get what Al was talking about, what he's working on now, and that kind of preludes. My next book is going to be called Beatles for Sale to Help. And that will be the last book in the album series. And, for those that aren't familiar with the books, I open up the books with a chapter from a perspective of what was going on in the early books in the UK. We do that first. And the idea is, if you were living in the UK, you could go to the store and there were 4 primary music magazines you could buy. And this is what you were learning about these songs in advance before even hearing them, and how the reviews were. In the US, there's a chapter on that, and that's a little bit different because we don't have any music magazines. We hear it first on the radio, and that's how we're exposed to it. And then Pierce writes what was going on in Canada. Al puts the times in context with chapters on what was going on in the world, what was going on in music other than the Beatles. Frank Daniels will pick a topic. Sometimes it'll be about film. Sometimes Frank will say, Bruce, you do the film. I want to do something more esoteric, like what was going on in rock and roll films before A Hard Day's Night,
Mhm.
and then Bill King will do his fan notes about what it was like. And they tie in well with what I call fan recollections, where normal everyday people write about their first reactions of hearing this music. And what surprised me is how many people bonded with their parents over this music, or their siblings over this music. And then lastly, sections on how the album covers were created, because that was an important part of the process. And then how the music itself was written and recorded. And, and so these are the things that all these books in the album series have. Al is a significant contributor to, I think Al more than anybody else, because he's doing two very significant chapters in each book. And, and it's really, they're fun to put together. And I urge people, if you haven't gone, go to my website, get one of them and see if you like the concept. And if you do, you're going to want all of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's beatle.net for those of you who want to go to Bruce's website. They're all fine books, and I can't say enough about his work. I don't know anyone that's written more on the Beatles than him. So, all right.
That's
Bruce is
true.
an icon.
Yeah.
And as are the other two here. Walter, what's going on with you? You want to talk about the RPM school a little bit?
Sure, sure. Yeah. Well, if we're talking about books, you mentioned my Beatles as musicians books and the book I did with Tim Riley, um, which I really enjoy, and they were just a pleasure to write. And it's been great, the mail I get from readers. It's really changed my life in a lot of ways to have that interaction with readers. It's really been great. My most recent book, though, is called Sex and Gender in Pop Rock Music. It came out last year, Bloomsbury Press. You can find it anywhere online. But yeah, I teach. Along with Jack Petrozelli, who's a keyboardist, guitarist, singer with the Fab Four, that also has Will Lee and Jimmy Vivino and a couple other, just really, really fantastic musicians, and they really know their Beatles. Jack and I and Cameron Grider, a New York producer who's worked with Sean Lennon and a lot of New York artists. We do this school where we teach, I think, 3 classes a year. It's pretty much settled into. And we'll have 6 or 8 consecutive Monday evenings. Eastern time, it's 5:30 to 7. And we'll be starting at, I think, October 21st might be the first night of our next class, which is all going to be on the Beatles in January 1969. So whether you call that the Get Back or the Let It Be sessions, that's what we'll
Let
be.
it be sessions.
Yeah, we'll be digging into all that music in October and November. What we do is we have a 45-minute session where the three of us, Jack Cameron and I, and all of our participants, meet together and talk over one song or maybe 2 songs. And then we go separate ways. And Jack and Cameron each work with performing musicians, guitarists, drummers, keyboardists, singers, and they work up performances of a few Beatle tracks. And I, on the other hand, have a seminar where I'll meet 45 minutes with a group that just wants to talk without doing stuff with our hands on Beatles stuff. So we have a blast. It's really great. And we have guests. This fall, Mark Lewison's going to be joining us for one night, and Katie Kapoorsh, who's got a number of books on the Beatles now. I think her most important one is Blackbird, on all different settings of the song Blackbird. And so I'm just really excited about that. And Ken will have the address, the web address available, but it's easy. It's rpm-school.com, and you can find us and get information on the class and see if it's like something you might want to participate in. We'd love to have anybody interested in the Beatles. No music background required. We just love to talk and listen, think about the Beatles.
It's almost like rock and roll camp.
It's very much like rock and roll camp. In fact, Jack produces a camp in the Catskills.
Yes.
in June every year, and I'm
Mm.
part of that. I do a couple of talks there, and lots of music, lots of live music. John Sebastian's
Right.
been involved. It's been a lot of fun. So,
If you're going to see John
Mhm.
Sebastian, see him in the Catskills. See him near
oh
Woodstock.
yeah,
Yeah.
he's got an amazing musical background. I had no idea until I talked with him last summer that his dad was a blues player, and he met all the Southern blues artists who were still playing in the 50s. He knew them all and lived in the village, grew up in the village. Fascinating musician, really, really an amazing guy.
Got to feel privileged when you got, that kind of exposure to great musicians like that. So,
Yeah. And this past spring, we had Kate Pearson of the B-52s
okay.
in.
Mm.
So it was she knows a lot about Yoko Ono. So and May Pang was there as well. May was part of the camp. So yeah, I don't know if we have a link to the camp information on our RPM school site, but it's very incestuous. We mix and mingle the camp and the school, very closely related.
Okay. Well, guys, this has been great. Thanks so much for being a part of this. And to all the new Beatle fans out there, discover their entire catalog, not just part of it.
For
You
sure.
don't just
Yeah,
learn,
absolutely.
you don't learn half the alphabet. You gotta learn the whole alphabet.
Yeah.
That's the only way you'll understand it all.
That's
But
why you buy all 9 books of my Beatles album series, even though 8 are only available now.
anyway, okay.
Don't just buy the later ones.
Mm.
Al, Walter, and Bruce, thanks for being here. Thanks to all of you for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. And we'll see you again real soon. Take care.